Europe is once again rattled by a thunderclap from Budapest, as Hungary, the EU's perennial maverick, raises the specter of cutting nearly 40% of Ukraine's imported electricity. At first glance, this may appear as just another quarrel inside the European Union, but under the cold lens of a military analyst, it is a strategic earthquake. For a country like Ukraine, already staggering under the weight of war, power grids shattered by missile strikes, and winter looming, energy is not simply about light bulbs and heaters, it is about survival, about sustaining the war effort, and about maintaining the will of a nation under siege. When Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's government allows talk of switching off the lifeline, the signal is unmistakable. Hungary is willing to transform electricity into a weapon as sharp as any missile. The timing is no coincidence. Ukrainian drones have recently targeted the Druzhba pipeline, the vast artery that pumps Russian oil deep into Central Europe. To Kyiv, this is a tactic to strike Moscow's economic veins. But to Budapest, it is a direct blow against its own security. Orbán seizes this moment not only to scold Ukraine, but also to remind Brussels that Hungary is no pawn to be ignored. The EU preaches unity, yet within its ranks, Orbán dares to dissent, and this dissent now carries lethal implications. Imagine Kyiv without Hungarian electricity, hospitals plunged into darkness, factories idled, families freezing as temperatures drop. Such imagery is not abstract. It is the nightmare that could unfold with a single political decision. The question that military strategists ask is not whether Hungary can do it, it clearly can, but whether Orbán intends to execute the threat or merely brandish it as a bargaining chip. Already his foreign minister, Péter Szijjártó, has amplified the warning, framing Ukraine's UAV strikes not as battlefield maneuvers, but as reckless provocations that endanger millions of Hungarians and Slovaks. This narrative is powerful, for it shifts the conflict from being a distant war on Ukrainian soil to being a crisis that directly touches EU citizens. In doing so, Orbán reframes Hungary not as an obstructionist, but as a defender of its people. Yet the deeper message cannot be missed. By declaring that Russia has already won, Orbán undercuts the entire Western storyline of resistance. His words echo like artillery in diplomatic chambers, leaving allies uneasy and adversaries emboldened. Europe has long struggled to contain Orbán's defiance, but now his defiance could alter the trajectory of Ukraine's survival. The battlefield is not only in Donbass or Kherson, it is in the control rooms of Budapest's power stations, where switches hold the fate of millions. This is the new front of the war, energy as a weapon, wielded not by Moscow alone, but by a member of the European Union itself. To grasp why Budapest is prepared to unleash such a dramatic threat, one must examine the spark that ignited this crisis: Ukraine's drone attacks against the Druzhba oil pipeline. This pipeline is not just a piece of infrastructure, it is the lifeline of Central Europe, stretching thousands of kilometers from Russian and Kazakh oil fields to Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and even Germany. For decades, it has symbolized the mutual dependence of East and West, a flow of crude that fed European industries and households. But in August, Ukrainian UAVs repeatedly struck the pipeline, causing disruptions that rippled directly into Hungarian and Slovak energy security. From Kyiv's perspective, these attacks were legitimate acts of war, striking at Moscow's revenue streams and punishing Russia for its aggression. Yet from Budapest's vantage point, they were tantamount to an assault on Hungary itself. Péter Szijjártó, Hungary's foreign minister, erupted on social media, accusing Ukraine of endangering millions of civilians. He warned bluntly that Budapest could retaliate in kind by closing the tap of electricity that sustains nearly 2/5 of Ukraine's grid. The rhetoric was sharp, but it was not only rhetoric. Orbán's government has long viewed energy as a sacred domain, untouchable by foreign interference, and any strike on Druzhba is read as crossing a red line. What makes this episode even more volatile is that it coincided with Ukraine's Independence Day, when President Volodymyr Zelensky, in his national address, directly alluded to Hungary as an obstacle to Kyiv's EU membership ambitions. This was not lost on Budapest. To Orbán, such words sounded like threats, evidence that Ukraine was deliberately pressuring Hungary on the political stage while attacking its energy arteries on the battlefield. Thus, the narrative in Budapest hardened. Ukraine was not a victim but an aggressor, destabilizing the very neighbors who had hosted its refugees and provided its largest share of imported electricity. Hungarian officials seized on this argument, portraying Kyiv as reckless and ungrateful, willing to jeopardize regional stability for tactical advantage. This framing is powerful because it flips the Western script. Suddenly, it is not Russia that is seen as the sole destabilizer, but Ukraine itself. From the standpoint of strategic communication, this is a masterstroke. Orbán understands that in the information war, controlling the narrative is as vital as controlling the grid. By amplifying Hungary's grievances, he sets the stage to justify whatever drastic move might follow. Military analysts recognize the danger here. Hungary is no longer simply a bystander in the conflict, but a player capable of changing the balance with a single policy lever. The attacks on Druzhba provided Budapest with the perfect pretext, turning technical sabotage into political ammunition. As tensions rise, the fundamental question becomes, will Orbán escalate from words to deeds? And if he does, what cascading consequences will this unleash on Ukraine, the EU, and NATO's fragile unity? To understand Viktor Orbán's posture, one must dissect his strategy of dual alignment, an approach that infuriates Brussels yet preserves Budapest's leverage. Orbán has mastered the art of playing East against West, maintaining cordial ties with Moscow while also signaling openness to Washington when it suits Hungary's interests. This two-faced diplomacy is not accidental. It is Orbán's survival mechanism in a Europe where Hungary is small in size but large in nuisance power. While the European Union champions solidarity, Orbán thrives on confrontation. He has repeatedly vetoed sanctions packages against Russia, blocked military aid for Ukraine, and derailed Kyiv's EU membership aspirations. At the same time, he presents himself at home as the defender of Hungarian households, securing cheap Russian energy while others in Europe scramble for costly alternatives. For him, pragmatism is painted as patriotism. What makes this strategy particularly striking is the contrast it produces. Hungary has mounted the largest humanitarian effort for Ukrainian refugees, housing and supporting thousands, yet in the same breath, Orbán threatens to plunge Ukraine into darkness. This is not hypocrisy, it is calculation. By being both benefactor and tormentor, Hungary ensures that neither Kyiv nor Brussels can afford to ignore it. Every veto, every dissenting speech, every meeting with Moscow is part of a wider game, forcing Europe to recognize Hungary's indispensability. Critics call him the Trojan horse of the EU, sabotaging unity from within. But Orbán frames himself differently, as the sole realist willing to say what others will not, that Ukraine is overextended, that Russia retains the upper hand, and that sanctions hurt Europe more than they hurt Moscow. His visit to Moscow in 2024 without notifying NATO allies was a perfect illustration. It outraged Brussels, embarrassed NATO, and emboldened Putin. Yet Orbán emerged domestically as a leader unafraid to stand up for Hungary's interests. This dual strategy also extends to the United States. Even as Hungary resists EU orthodoxy, Budapest has quietly sought channels to Washington, even briefing Donald Trump on energy tensions with Ukraine. The message is clear. Hungary can pivot either way, and whichever side wants to keep Budapest aligned must pay attention to its demands. In military analysis, This is the equivalent of holding a central position on the battlefield. From there, one can strike in multiple directions or retreat to safety at will. Orbán's diplomacy is a shield and a sword shielding Hungary from isolation while cutting into EU unity. As long as he controls both the rhetoric and the resources, he can keep Hungary at the center of Europe's storm, no matter how much Brussels wishes to sideline him. The consequences of Hungary moving from threat to action would be catastrophic for Ukraine, and military analysts warn that the timing could not be more dangerous. Nearly 40% of Ukraine's imported electricity flows from Hungary, and Kyiv's domestic energy grid has already been battered by relentless Russian strikes. If Budapest were to close the tap, the shock would ripple through every level of Ukrainian society. Hospitals struggling to treat the wounded would plunge into darkness, forcing surgeons to rely on generators or abandon critical operations. Factories producing weapons and supplies for the front lines would grind to a halt, undermining the war effort. Families already displaced by shelling would face a winter without heat, their resilience tested beyond human limits. This is the essence of energy warfare. One decision in Budapest could inflict more pain on Kyiv than dozens of missiles. The specter of such a move has already shaken Ukraine's leadership. President Zelensky, in defiant speeches, continues to portray Ukraine as resilient and sovereign, but behind closed doors, officials know that energy shortages could fracture morale and weaken their bargaining position with the West. Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha fired back online, declaring that Hungary has no right to dictate Ukraine's military or political choices. His words carried pride, but pride does not power homes. Orbán's camp has carefully framed their stance to appear reluctant, yet justified. They claim they do not want Ukrainian children to freeze. But if Kyiv insists on striking pipelines, then Budapest must defend itself by any means, including cutting the lifeline. This framing is clever, for it paints Hungary as both compassionate and uncompromising, a nation pushed to the brink by Ukrainian recklessness. From the perspective of the EU, the danger is broader. If a member state uses electricity as leverage against Ukraine, it undermines the entire European narrative of solidarity. The Kremlin, watching closely, would celebrate such disunity. For NATO, the threat is equally troubling. Orbán's alignment with Moscow is no secret, and if Hungary truly strangles Ukraine's grid, it sends a message that one NATO member is willing to advance Russian strategic aims by other means. This places Washington and Brussels in a bind. Punish Hungary and risk further fracture, or appease Orbán and betray Kyiv. Either option is a gift to Moscow. Thus, the crisis is not merely about power lines, it is about power politics, the delicate balance of unity, and the vulnerabilities of a coalition tested by war. In military analysis, the image is stark. Ukraine's battlefield is expanding beyond trenches and missiles into hospitals, homes, and factories, where the flick of a switch in Budapest could determine survival. Orbán understands this power, and by wielding it, he forces every actor, Ukraine, the EU, NATO, to recalculate their strategies in real time. The broader strategic picture shows clearly why Orbán's stance shakes Europe at its core. By declaring bluntly that Russia has already won, he dismantles the Western narrative of unity and defiance. His defiance sends signals in every direction. It strengthens Moscow's hand, emboldens skeptics inside the EU, and forces Washington to acknowledge that Hungary cannot be treated as a compliant junior partner. In 2024, Orbán's unannounced trip to Moscow already rattled NATO. Now his threat to extinguish Ukraine's electricity proves that Hungary wields tangible power over Kyiv's very survival. Analysts warn that such rhetoric could embolden others in Europe who quietly doubt Ukraine's trajectory, pushing them to demand compromise with Russia. The symbolism is stark. Hungary, a NATO and EU member, is playing the heretic, saying aloud what others dare not, that Ukraine is weaker than admitted, Russia has secured its strategic gains, and Europe risks irrelevance if it does not forge its own path. Reports that Budapest could host a U.S. Majors Russia-Ukraine summit reinforce this image of Orbán as a disruptive yet indispensable broker. For Kyiv, the implications are dire. Entering talks under Budapest's sponsorship would look like capitulation, especially if paralleled by an energy crisis triggered from Hungarian switches. For Brussels, the fracture would undermine EU's very claim to strategic relevance. For NATO, it would be proof that one of its own is advancing Russian aims. From a military analysis perspective, the conclusion is sobering. Energy has become Europe's sharpest weapon, and Orbán knows how to wield it better than most generals. This war is no longer confined to the trenches of Donbass. It is also fought in power plants and pipelines, in the cold silence of a blackout that can change the course of nations. Hungary now holds that dagger over Kyiv's chest, and by brandishing it, Orbán reminds the world of one brutal truth. The fate of Ukraine, the unity of Europe, and the credibility of the West may hinge not on a battlefield explosion, but on a political switch in Budapest. If you want to keep following these turning points of the war and the hidden power struggles shaping Europe's future, stay with us, share your thoughts, and subscribe, because the story is far from over.